My name is Thomas Whitaker. I am 68 years old, a retired forensic accountant living in the quiet outskirts of Greenwood Village, Colorado, just south of Denver. For 3 years, since my wife Eleanor passed, the silence of this house has been the one companion that never misses an appointment. My daughter Natalie says she worries about me rattling around alone in a place this size. That is why she insists on our Wednesday lunches. She says it is family time. She says it is good for me. She says it gives me a reason to get out of the house and spend time with my grandson. But I have learned that when Natalie says something is for my benefit, I should probably examine the fine print. Last Wednesday, during one of those carefully managed family lunches, my life turned in a direction I never saw coming. My neighbor called me, her voice tight with the kind of restraint that only shows up when someone is trying very hard not to panic. She asked if I was expecting anyone at the house. When I said no, she lowered her voice and said, "Then why is there a moving truck in your driveway?" Before the alarm had time to settle into my bones, before I could even fully process what she was saying, I heard something across the table that made my blood run cold. My daughter, Natalie, exchanged a look with her husband, Gavin Cole. It was not a look of concern. It was not a look of surprise. It was the look of two people who had just realized someone else had seen their hand before the cards hit the table. Then Gavin laughed. It was quick, sharp, almost involuntary. He swallowed it a second too late and disguised it as a cough. But I had spent 40 years reading financial crimes in spreadsheets, signatures, cash flows, and the nervous habits of people who believed they were too clever to be caught. I knew guilt when I heard it. In that moment I understood, with a clarity so cold it felt almost merciful, that the real threat to my life was not some stranger with a truck in my driveway. It was sitting across from me, stealing rosemary fries from my grandson's plate. What neither of them understood was that they were laughing at a man who had spent 4 decades unraveling fraud schemes worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A forensic accountant learns one truth above all others. No matter how polished the lie, no matter how many entities or signatures or timed payments are arranged around it, every crime leaves a trail. They had just shown me exactly where to start looking. The restaurant was one of those fashionable farm-to-table places in Cherry Creek, the kind of place where the menu reads like a memoir written by a beat. Natalie had chosen it, of course. She always chose expensive places for our Wednesday lunches, and I always paid. It was one of those family patterns I had noticed without ever forcing myself to account for it. I sat in a booth designed for photographs rather than comfort and watched my 6-year-old grandson, Noah, push truffle fries around his plate. The boy had Eleanor's eyes, the same soft hazel that used to unmake me with one glance. Looking at him was comfort and injury at once. Natalie sat across from me with one eye on her phone and the other on a conversation she was only pretending to be part of. My daughter had grown into the sort of woman who understood her own beauty as a form of leverage and applied it with precision. Gavin sat beside her with the lazy confidence of a man who had spent his whole adult life living on the promise of money that had not quite arrived. He called himself a developer. That was his preferred word. It sounded more substantial than speculator. "More water, Dad?" Natalie asked without looking up. "Yes. Thank you," I said, watching Noah try to build a small tower from his fries. My phone buzzed against the table. The caller ID showed Priya Desai, my neighbor of 14 years. Priya never called unless something was wrong. She had been a trauma nurse for nearly 30 years. She did not rattle easily, and she did not waste other people's time. I answered at once. "Thomas," she said, "are you home right now?" "No. I am at lunch with Natalie." "Why? What happened?" "There is a moving truck in your driveway," she said. "A large one. 3 men in uniforms. They are carrying boxes out of your house right now. I am looking at them through my front window. Did you hire movers?" The world shifted under me. My house. Eleanor's house. The place where 35 years of marriage, grief, memory, files, and quiet had been stored with almost religious care. I stood so fast I knocked over my water glass. Ice skittered across the table like frightened witnesses. Natalie, I have to go. Someone is at my house. Someone is taking things. What I expected was alarm. What I expected was my daughter standing up, grabbing her purse, offering to drive me home. What I got instead was that look, that split-second glance between her and Gavin, full of meaning they never intended me to catch. Then Gavin laughed. Wrong sound, wrong timing, wrong instinct. He turned it into a cough and thumped his chest with theatrical force. "Wrong pipe," he said, eyes watering. "Sorry, Tom. It is probably nothing. Delivery truck? Wrong address? Those GPS systems mess up all the time in neighborhoods like yours." Natalie nodded too quickly. "He is right. Remember when that patio set was delivered to the Whitmans by mistake? Let us just finish lunch and then we can all go together. No need to panic." But by then I had already seen it. The flash of fear in Natalie's eyes. The laugh Gavin could not hide quickly enough. For 40 years, I had made a living catching people inside lies they did not even know they were telling. I could read deception in the spacing of numbers on an expense report. I could smell fraud in a poorly timed reassurance, and every instinct I had ever honed was screaming that my daughter knew exactly what was happening at my house. I left cash on the table, kissed Noah on the top of his head, and walked out without another word. I could feel their eyes on me all the way to the parking lot, and I knew with a certainty that settled deep in the chest that I was not just driving home to investigate a burglary. I was driving toward the thing that was about to break whatever remained of my faith in my own family. The truck was gone by the time I arrived. In its place was only the absence it had left behind, tire marks on the concrete, and a feeling in the air like a room after bad news. Priya met me at the front door, worry drawn across her face in hard lines. "I got photos," she said, pressing her phone into my hands. I did not know what else to do. I scrolled through them with trembling fingers. A professional moving crew, matching shirts, a truck marked Aspen Ridge Premier Movers, clear license plate, at least a dozen boxes loaded, no urgency in their movements, no fear. Whoever had sent them believed they had every right to be there. The police arrived 20 minutes later. 2 officers, both young enough to look at me with the patient politeness reserved for elderly men they suspected might be confused. They took my statement, walked the house, found no signs of forced entry, and then examined the security system Eleanor had insisted we install years before and I had upgraded after her death. That was when the first real crack appeared. "Sir," the older officer said, frowning at her tablet, according to the monitoring log, "the alarm was disabled yesterday at 2:43 p.m. using the master code. Front door entry this morning at 10:11 a.m., also by master code. We are showing authorized access." Authorized. The word hung in the room like smoke. "I have not given that code to anyone," I said, and even as I spoke the sentence I felt it fail under its own weight. Because I had given it to Natalie last year when she offered to check on the house while I was having a cardiac stress test. I had given it to her because she was my daughter. I had given it to her because trust is easy when it has known your face since birth. The officers suggested I change my codes, inventory my belongings, and contact the county if any property documents appeared to be missing. They left with the kind of sympathetic expressions people wear when they suspect a family dispute will resolve itself if the old man calms down. They were wrong. After they left, I walked through the house slowly and methodically, not looking for what had been taken, but for what had been disturbed. That is a different instinct. Any thief can remove things. What I wanted to know was whether someone had searched. My home office answered almost immediately. The angle of my desk chair was wrong. The pens in the holder were turned the wrong direction. The thin skin of dust on the lower file drawer had been wiped in finger-wide streaks that caught the afternoon light. Someone had sat in my chair and taken their time. Someone who did not feel the need to hurry. Someone who knew exactly what they were after. I opened the filing cabinet and pulled the drawer labeled Real Property. The folder was too light. The original deed was gone. The title insurance binder was gone. The discharge paperwork for the home equity line Eleanor and I had paid off years earlier was gone. In their place sat a single document I had never seen in my life. A quitclaim deed, dated 3 months earlier, transferring ownership of my house to an entity called Whitaker Family Asset Group, LLC. My signature was at the bottom, notarized and witnessed, except I had never signed it. I had never heard of Whitaker Family Asset Group, LLC, and I had certainly never agreed to transfer away the house where Eleanor and I had lived for 35 years. The house was worth, according to the last county assessment, just under $1.6 million. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down. But my mind, trained by a lifetime of working through lies, had already begun assembling the architecture of the crime. A quitclaim deed does not sell a house. It transfers title without warranties, often between relatives, into trusts, or into holding companies. It is also one of the preferred tools in elder property fraud because it is quiet, fast, and easily buried inside family language. Someone had forged my signature and transferred my home into a shell company. And that someone almost certainly had my alarm code, knew my filing system, and was comfortable enough in my home to search my office in daylight. Natalie's face came back to me. Then Gavin's laugh. No, I thought. Then, a second later, yes. That night I did not sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, a yellow legal pad, and the numb concentration that had carried me through some of the ugliest investigations of my career. I started where I always started. I followed the paper. Colorado property records are public enough to be useful if you know where to look. Within minutes, I confirmed my worst suspicion. 3 months earlier, title to my home had in fact been transferred into Whitaker Family Asset Group, LLC. The LLC itself had been formed in Delaware 6 months earlier through a registered agent service that specialized in privacy structures. I had seen dozens of companies like it in fraud cases, anonymous enough to discourage a casual search. Never anonymous enough to hold under real pressure. Then I pulled my credit reports from all 3 bureaus. That was when my stomach truly dropped. 3 months earlier, someone had opened a home equity line of credit against my property for $680,000. The lender was Front Range Community Credit Union. The account status was current, which meant payments were being made on time, but not by me. I had never applied for the loan, never signed for it, never received the money. I logged into my primary bank, then my brokerage accounts, then my retirement distributions. Everything on the surface looked normal. Pension deposits on time, Social Security exactly where it should be, investment balances intact. That was almost worse. Whoever had done this knew enough to leave the visible parts of my financial life untouched. They had no interest in triggering alerts. They were trying to skin the house while keeping me calm. The HELOC account showed up when I searched under my Social Security number through the credit union's portal. It was linked to an unfamiliar email address. Online access had been established in my name, but with someone else's contact information. The entire $680,000 had been drawn in a single transfer the same day the account opened. The funds had been sent to an external account, and minimum payments were being drafted from that same outside source. Just enough to keep the loan from drawing scrutiny. Classic fraud behavior. Keep it current. Keep it boring. Bleed the asset quietly. I spent the next 3 hours going through every piece of mail I had kept for the past 6 months. Eleanor used to mock my filing habits. That night, those habits may have saved my life. Buried in a stack from 4 months earlier was a confirmation letter from Rocky Mountain Mobile Notary Services, thanking me for my appointment on March 18th and expressing hope that I had been satisfied with the services of one Melissa Grant. I had never scheduled a notary. I checked my calendar. On March 18th, I had been at my annual physical with fasting labs. Natalie had driven me. She had insisted on driving me, actually, saying she did not want me lightheaded behind the wheel after blood work. She had known precisely when I would be gone and for how long. The pieces were falling into place now, and each one hurt more than the last. The father in me kept reaching for alternatives. Maybe Gavin had done it without her. Maybe he had manipulated her. Maybe she had signed something without understanding it. But the forensic accountant in me knew what the pattern meant. Timing, access, document removal, notary scheduling, alarm code usage, coordinated appearances of innocence. This was not one impulsive act. It was a system. I thought about calling Natalie and confronting her directly. The part of me that had rocked her to sleep when she was 2 wanted to hear her deny it and believe her. But experience won. Confrontation would only buy them time. Time to delete emails, coordinate stories, destroy whatever paper I had not found yet. If my daughter was involved and every fact now pointed that way, then she had been working this for months. She would have explanations ready. She would know exactly which emotions to put on. I needed someone who owed Natalie nothing. The next morning I called a number I had kept in my wallet for 11 years. Daniel Serrano had been the FBI's lead financial investigator on a municipal pension fraud case where I had served as an outside expert. We had spent 8 months together in conference rooms, tracing false invoices and nominee entities until 3 executives ended up in federal prison. Daniel had retired from the Bureau 3 years earlier and opened an investigation and compliance firm in Denver. I had not expected to need him, certainly not for my own life. "Daniel," I said when he picked up, "it is Thomas Whitaker. I need your help." 40 minutes later, I was in his office telling him everything. He listened without interrupting, hands folded, face unreadable. When I finished, he stayed quiet a long moment. "Thomas," he said finally, "what you are describing has every marker of organized elder financial abuse by someone in your inner circle. The alarm code, the document search, the use of a mobile notary on a day you were out, the shell entity, the drawdown structure on the line of credit. This was planned. Carefully." "I know," I said. "I just need proof that will survive court." He nodded. "Then we do it quietly. No confrontation, no warnings. You keep behaving normally. We subpoena the notary records. We identify who formed the LLC and who controls it. We trace where the money went after the credit union funded the line. And we do all of it before your daughter suspects she is under a microscope." "Can you work around family dinners?" I asked. Daniel almost smiled. "Family fraud has better access and worse discipline. It is often easier than corporate work once you stop hoping for innocence." The next 3 weeks were the hardest of my life. I kept the Wednesday lunches. I sat across from Natalie and Gavin and smiled through discussions of Noah's school, vacation plans, and Gavin's alleged development pipeline. I watched Natalie show me photographs of a long weekend in Santa Barbara that must have cost thousands. I listened to Gavin complain about temporary liquidity issues in his company, Cole's Strategic Land Works, as if cash flow problems were acts of God rather than consequences of the way he lived. I paid the check every time. I laughed when required. I kissed Noah on the forehead and told him I would see him soon. At night, Daniel sent updates. Melissa Grant, the notary, was easy to find and even easier to pressure. When one of Daniel's investigators confronted her with the deed and the appointment record, she collapsed quickly. She admitted Natalie had booked the appointment. Natalie had met her at my house. Natalie had signed my name while presenting a counterfeit identification card with my photograph and altered details. Melissa had chosen not to look too hard because the fee had been generous and the questions inconvenient. Then Daniel's team traced the LLC. Whitaker Family Asset Group LLC had been formed through a Delaware agent, but the operating agreement had been drafted by a Denver attorney named Martin Keller. Keller had represented Gavin in several prior real estate entities, most of which had short lives, aggressive debt, and poor endings. One had already been named in a civil fraud suit quietly settled 18 months earlier. Daniel pulled corporate filings, litigation records, and registered agent crosslinks until Gavin's fingerprint was everywhere. Then came the money. The $680,000 from the HELOC had been wired into the LLC's operating account and then dispersed almost immediately. $220,000 to cover Gavin's personal and business credit obligations, $170,000 for the down payment on a house in Steamboat Springs titled solely in Natalie's name, $90,000 into an online brokerage account that showed a grotesque appetite for speculative options trades and almost no discipline, $180,000 withdrawn over 3 months in structured cash transactions below the thresholds that draw automatic bank scrutiny. The remaining funds lost in fees, transfers, and debt service. They had not borrowed against my house to survive. They had gutted it to finance the life they thought they deserved. Daniel's team found more. Emails between Natalie and a real estate broker in Cherry Hills Village discussing the sale of my house, a draft listing package, suggested staging improvements, a proposed asking price of $1.5 million. They intended to put my home on the market in 6 weeks, using the fraudulent quitclaim deed to establish ownership. By the time I would have realized what was happening, they could have sold the property, moved the cash, and left me fighting through civil court to prove I still owned the walls around me. I wanted to move immediately. Daniel told me to wait. "We already have enough to show fraud," he said. "But if you move now, you stop them. If you wait 1 step longer, you expose them beyond recovery. I want them on record. I want them speaking from inside their own lie when it closes around them." 3 days later, I invited Natalie and Gavin to dinner at my house. I told them I wanted to discuss estate planning. I watched Natalie's face carefully when I said it. There it was. Not grief, not concern, hunger, quick and bright, before she managed to soften it into daughterly concern. "Of course, Dad," she said. "We have actually been wanting to talk to you about that, just to make sure everything is in order for the future." The future. By that she meant the one in which I was gone, and the asset had finished converting. I made Eleanor's pot roast using the recipe she had carried from her mother's kitchen into ours. I set the table with our wedding china. I used the cloth napkins Eleanor preferred on Sundays. I made the room look as normal and safe as possible. Criminals relax when the stage feels familiar. They arrived at 6 o'clock with Noah. My grandson ran into my arms, and for one dangerous second I almost called the whole thing off. There are costs to justice no one prepares you for. One of them is the knowledge that a child will have to grow up inside the wreckage adults make. But I could not let sentiment protect the people who had counted on it from the beginning. We sat down to dinner. I let them lead. Natalie talked about how much she worried about me being alone in such a large house. Gavin mentioned a luxury senior community outside Boulder with valet service, private dining, and on-site medical care. They were setting the table for the pitch they had already rehearsed. Finally, over coffee and pie, Natalie placed her hand on mine. "Dad," she said softly, "this house is so much for one person. The yard, the maintenance, the taxes. Gavin and I were thinking maybe it would be easier for you to sell and move somewhere that gives you more support." I looked down at her hand and remembered how small it had once been around my finger. Then I remembered that same hand forging my name on a quitclaim deed. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice perfectly even, "I have been thinking about my assets quite a bit lately." Natalie's eyes brightened. Gavin leaned forward. "Really?" Natalie said. "Yes," I said. "In fact, I have spent the last few weeks reviewing everything very carefully." Then I placed a manila folder on the table between us. Natalie went pale. Gavin's hand jerked and knocked over his water glass. Neither of them moved to clean it. "That folder contains copies of the forged quitclaim deed transferring title of this house into Whitaker Family Asset Group, LLC, I said. It also contains the records for the fraudulent home equity line of credit you opened in my name. The transfer ledger showing where the funds went, including the Steamboat Springs property, Gavin's debt payments, the brokerage account, and the structured cash withdrawals. It contains a statement from Melissa Grant, the notary Natalie hired to witness my forged signature. And it contains your email correspondence with the broker preparing to list this house for sale in approximately 6 weeks. Natalie started crying almost immediately. Whether from fear, shame, or self-preservation, I could not tell. Gavin looked toward the hallway, then toward the back door, calculating. His eyes had gone flat. "Please do not try to leave," I said to him. "Daniel Serrano is outside, and he did not come alone." "Dad," Natalie said, voice breaking, "please, you do not understand." "No," I said. "Then explain it to me." "We were desperate," she said. "Gavin's business was collapsing. We were going to lose everything. We were going to pay it back. We just needed time." I looked at my daughter and felt something inside me settle into a harder form. Not hatred, not exactly. Something colder, more final. "You were not trying to save your family," I said quietly. "You were trying to strip it for parts. There is a difference." Gavin tried to recover. "Tom, let us be rational here. These things are more complicated than they look on paper." That almost made me laugh. "I spent 40 years making men like you regret saying things like that," I told him. "Paper is precisely where complicated things become simple." The doorbell rang. Natalie flinched. Daniel entered first, calm and measured as always, followed by 2 federal agents and local officers. Daniel did not gloat. He never had that weakness. He simply nodded to me, then laid additional copies of the evidence on the dining room sideboard. Natalie and Gavin were read their rights in the same room where Eleanor had once hosted Christmas dinners. Noah began crying from the den. I went to him while the agent spoke to his parents. He did not understand why his mother's face had changed or why his father suddenly looked smaller. He only knew the room no longer felt safe. I held him until Priya, who had agreed earlier that day to come over if needed, stepped in to take him into the guest room with juice and crayons while the arrest unfolded. The weeks that followed peeled back the rest of the lie. This had not been a single act of panic. Gavin had been running variants of this scheme for years, usually through shell entities, false collateral representations, and title manipulations involving older relatives, private lenders, and vulnerable investors who mistook his confidence for competence. Natalie had not merely assisted. She had participated knowingly. Emails, texts, document drafts, and calendar entries made that plain. They had already drained nearly $300,000 from Gavin's widowed aunt in Sarasota through a fabricated redevelopment note. They had been quietly discussing a similar structure involving one of Natalie's cousins in Boise under the guise of short-term bridge financing tied to inherited land. Federal prosecutors offered Gavin a cooperation deal if he would identify the other parties, lawyers, and facilitators involved in several related fraud matters. He accepted before the week was out. Natalie, faced with evidence that was documentary, digital, and devastatingly chronological, pleaded guilty rather than go to trial. Gavin received 6 years. Natalie received 4. The deed to my house was voided and title was restored to me. The fraudulent HELOC was unwound after extensive litigation and insurer intervention. The house in Steamboat Springs was sold by court order. The brokerage account was seized. A portion of the stolen funds was recovered. Not enough to make me whole. Nothing could have done that. But enough to prove that they would not be allowed to keep living inside the comfort they built with my ruin. Daniel's team helped me lock everything down. Credit freezes, identity theft flags, replacement deeds, new alarm protocols, bank authentication changes, clean mail handling. We secured every seam they had used. But security after betrayal is a peculiar thing. It protects the structure while reminding you how easily trust once opened the door. Noah now lives with Eleanor's younger sister in Fort Collins. She had always distrusted Gavin, and unlike me, she had never let Natalie charm her into silence. She is steady, warm, and practical, which is precisely what a child needs after adults have shattered the floor beneath him. I see him every weekend. We build model airplanes. We go for pancakes. I tell him stories about his grandmother, about the way she made peach cobbler, about how she used to sing under her breath while paying bills, about how she could look at a man for 10 seconds and know whether to hand him a second cup of coffee or send him away. I do not tell him the full truth about his mother. Not yet. For now, I tell him she made grave choices and is living with the consequences. That is enough truth for a child. I still have Wednesday lunches. Now they are with Priya and Daniel. Sometimes we go back to that same restaurant in Cherry Creek. We talk about weather, bad golf, Noah's reading level, and the state of Denver traffic. Ordinary things, safe things. I sit in the same kind of booth, look at the same polished glassware, and sometimes remember that afternoon when my life split cleanly in two. I think about Natalie in prison more often than I like to admit. What I feel is not satisfaction. It is not clean grief either. It is something quieter and more permanent than either, like a scar that has sealed but still aches in certain weather. This whole thing taught me something I wish I had learned without paying for it in bloodless betrayal. Love is not the same thing as trust. You can love someone completely and still verify every document they hand you. You can cherish your family and still protect yourself from what ambition, fear, vanity, or greed can make of them. Unconditional love is a beautiful thing. Unconditional trust is not. I also learned that retirement does not erase a lifetime of skill. For 40 years, I followed money through lies, shell structures, reimbursement trails, asset transfers, and forged signatures. I thought that chapter of my life had closed when I left the profession. But when the crime came to my own front door, carried out by my own blood, those same instincts were what saved my house, my name, and whatever remained of my life. Some people would ask whether I regret turning in my own daughter. No. I regret that she gave me a reason. Blood does not grant immunity. Family is not a hunting license. The moment Natalie looked at me and saw not a father but an asset, she stepped across a line from which there was no honest return. I loved the child she had been. I suspect I always will. But I did not owe the woman she became my silence. And silence, in the end, is what people like Gavin count on. It is what schemes like this feed on. It is what lets theft dress itself up as family business until the house is gone and the old man is left standing in his own driveway with nothing but tire marks and paperwork. I had spent my life teaching juries and auditors that fraud is rarely loud at the beginning. It starts in access, in assumptions, in trust given without inspection. I knew that professionally. I just never imagined I would have to learn it personally. Now I lock my doors. Now I read every line. Now I trust less easily and more carefully. And if that sounds cold, so be it. Cold at my age is better than blind.